In 2006, a man walked out of Boeing after 37 years. He had joined in 1969 and worked on the 727, the 747, and the 767. He ran the 777 program, then all of Boeing Commercial Airplanes through a production meltdown through September 11th and out the other side. Twice, Boeing's board looked at that record and gave the top job to someone else. So he left. He took over an American company that had just lost $12.6 billion in a year, in an industry he had never worked in. 2 years later, Detroit collapsed, and that company became the only American automaker that took no government bailout. His name is Alan Mulally, and the reason this matters isn't the biography. It's that he then ran the exact opposite playbook to the one Boeing handed him, and we get to watch both play out at once. There's a catch, though, and it's in who replaced him. When Mulally left, Boeing needed someone to run its commercial aircraft division. It chose Scott Carson, a finance executive with no engineering background at all. The man who had spent his career building aircraft was replaced at the airplane company by a man who had not. And the record he left behind was not a matter of opinion. Mulally took over Boeing Commercial Airplanes in September 1998, in the middle of a production meltdown so severe that assembly lines in Renton and Everett had shut down for a month, and Boeing lost money for the first time in 50 years. He ran that division through the aftermath of September 11th, through more than 50,000 local layoffs, through production being cut in half. It made a profit every one of those years. By the time he left, Boeing Commercial was back on top of the industry. So what does a company do with an executive like that? It gives the top job to someone else and hands his division to a man who has never built anything. That isn't a scandal. Nobody broke a rule. It's a preference. It was consistent. And to understand it, you need one piece of financial vocabulary. It explains almost everything that follows. The metric is return on net assets. Inside Boeing, they called it RONA. The idea is simple. Take what the business earns and divide it by the assets the business owns. Factories, tooling, land, inventory. The higher the number, the more efficiently your capital is working, and the more Wall Street likes you. Now look at the arithmetic, because this is where it gets interesting. There are two ways to improve that ratio. You can increase the top number by earning more, which is hard, slow, and takes a decade when your product is an airliner. Or you can shrink the bottom number by owning less. Owning less is faster. You can do it in a quarter. Sell the factory, and the ratio improves the day the sale closes, without building a single better product. That is the whole engine of this story. And once you see it, Boeing's decisions across 20 years stop looking like a series of mistakes and start looking like one strategy, executed consistently. Here's where the two men collide. After Boeing merged with McDonnell Douglas in 1997, Harry Stonecipher came with it, and in 2003 he became chief executive when Phil Condit resigned during a Pentagon procurement scandal. Stonecipher's focus was shareholder returns, profits, and return on net assets. Mulally's focus was engineering programs. Those two priorities do not point in the same direction, and according to reporting by the aviation analyst Scott Hamilton, Stonecipher at one point suggested Mulally should be fired over precisely that clash. And then came the order that this whole story turns on. Stonecipher told Mulally to sell Wichita. Understand what Wichita was. Boeing had been building aircraft in Wichita, Kansas, for decades. It was where the fuselages came from. It was so central to American aviation that the city called itself the air capital of the world. It was not a peripheral asset. It was the front half of the airplane. In 2005, Boeing sold it. The buyer was Onex, a Canadian private equity firm. The price was roughly $900 million in cash, plus the assumption of about $300 million in debt. The operation was renamed Spirit AeroSystems. Now, apply the metric. Boeing didn't lose that factory. It didn't fail to keep it. It sold it deliberately, and the reason was the ratio. Take a capital-heavy manufacturing asset off your balance sheet. Keep buying the same parts from the same people in the same building, and your return on net assets improves immediately. On paper, it worked exactly as designed. The model boosted Boeing's RONA. And on paper, an independent supplier free to sell to Airbus and defense customers should have driven costs down through higher volume. What it also created was a seam, a physical and contractual handover point in the middle of building an aircraft, where accountability could get lost between two companies with different shareholders, different incentives, and different quarterly pressures. Hold that thought. We come back to it. So that was the playbook Mulally was handed. Own less, improve the ratio, let the balance sheet get lighter. So what does that man do when he finally gets to set the strategy himself? In September 2006, he became chief executive of Ford. The company had lost $12.6 billion that year. It was losing money on essentially every car it built. The chief executive of JetBlue later said he thought Mulally was insane for taking the job. On the 29th of November 2006, Mulally stood up in a ballroom in a New York hotel in front of the country's biggest banks and asked to borrow an enormous amount of money. To get it, he offered as collateral effectively everything Ford owned: the factories, the intellectual property, the Mustang and F-150 trademarks, and the blue oval logo itself, the mark that had been on the nose of Ford cars for a century. It was the first time in Ford's 103-year history that the company had pledged its core operations as collateral. Bill Ford, the founder's great-grandson, later said that signing those papers stopped his heart for a moment. They raised $23.6 billion. Now here's the detail that matters most, and it's the one that usually gets skipped. Nobody thought Ford needed this. The economy in late 2006 was healthy. Wall Street read the request as an act of desperation from a company in trouble. Mulally's own stated reason was that the money would give Ford a cushion to protect against a recession or some other unexpected event. There wasn't a recession. There was no evidence of one coming. He borrowed against a hypothetical. 2 years later, the hypothetical arrived. When the financial crisis hit, credit markets froze and car sales collapsed. General Motors and Chrysler ran out of money and went to Washington, borrowing $17.4 billion in federal money and going through bankruptcy reorganization as a condition of the rescue. Ford didn't take a cent. It had already borrowed its own money, on its own terms, from private banks back when the banks were still lending. The loan carried the company through more than $30 billion of losses between 2006 and 2008. And notice what he did with the money, because borrowing is only half of it. Ford sold or shut 5 of its 7 brands. Aston Martin went in 2007. Jaguar and Land Rover went to Tata in 2008. It closed or sold a quarter of its plants and cut the global workforce by more than a third, which looks, at first glance, exactly like the Boeing playbook. Sell assets, shrink the company? It isn't. And the difference is the point. Ford sold the things it didn't build its future on and poured the proceeds straight back into the products it did: the Fusion, the Explorer, the trucks. Boeing sold the factory that made the front half of its best-selling airplane. One company was pruning, the other was cutting into the trunk. So look at what the same man did in 2 consecutive jobs. At Boeing, he was ordered to sell a factory to make a ratio look better. At Ford, he mortgaged every factory the company had and the logo on the building to buy insurance against something that hadn't happened yet. Both are decisions about assets. They point in exactly opposite directions. One treats what you own as a drag on the numbers. The other treats what you own as the only thing standing between you and Washington. Which raises the obvious question. If Mulally was capable of that, why did Boeing say no to him? Twice? And the honest answer isn't that the board was stupid. It's that the board was consistent. Look at who they picked instead. In 2003, after Condit resigned, Boeing brought back Harry Stone Cipher, who had come from McDonnell Douglas and whose entire orientation was financial. In July 2005, after Stone Cipher was forced out over a conduct issue, the board chose Jim McNerney from 3M, who had spent 19 years at General Electric and had lost the race to succeed Jack Welch in 2000. Then, when Mulally sought the presidency at Boeing in 2006, the answer was no again, and he went to Ford. There's a pattern in those choices, and it isn't random. The board wanted a financial operator, and Mulally was an engineer who ran programs. He wasn't rejected because he was worse at the job. He was rejected because he was a different sort of executive from the one the company had decided it wanted. Boards choose the future they're planning for. Boeing chose that one repeatedly. Now, before we go further, one honest caveat, because this story gets told carelessly all the time. You cannot prove that the McDonnell-Douglas merger ruined Boeing, and you cannot prove that hiring Mulally would have prevented anything that came after. Companies are not laboratories. There are too many variables, too many people, too many decisions. What you can do is look at a control case. Same man, same country, same recession, different chair, different playbook, and a result you can check. The company that followed the financial playbook and the company that followed the asset playbook both ran through the same crisis at the same time. One of them needed the federal government, the other one didn't. That isn't proof, it's evidence, and it's the closest thing to a controlled comparison that corporate history ever offers. And then the story closes a loop nobody could have scripted. Remember that seam, the handover point created when Boeing sold Wichita to improve a ratio. On the 5th of January 2024, a door plug blew out of an Alaska Airlines 737 EMAX 9 shortly after takeoff. The fuselage it came out of was built in Wichita by Spirit AeroSystems, the company Boeing had sold. Investigators and whistleblowers pointed at exactly the thing the sale had created: quality accountability falling into the gap between two organizations, with inspectors under pressure to keep production moving. So Boeing bought it back. The deal was agreed in 2024 and completed on the 8th of December 2025. The price was $4.7 billion in stock and a total transaction value of around $8.3 billion once Spirit's debts were included. Roughly 15,000 people came back under the Boeing name. So what did the ratio cost? Put the two numbers side by side. Boeing sold Wichita for about $900 million. It bought it back for $8.3 billion. And then, in May of this year, Boeing announced it would invest a further $1.3 billion into the Wichita site over 3 years. More than the entire original sale price spent on rebuilding what it had sold, on top of what it paid to get it back. 20 years to end up owning the same factory again, with a different number on the balance sheet. So what did that sale really buy? For a while, exactly what it was designed to buy. The ratio improved, the balance sheet got lighter. Nobody who approved it was lying about the arithmetic. The metric did exactly what the metric was supposed to do. The problem is that return on net assets is a measurement, and measurements are not the same as the thing they measure. You can raise the number by improving the business or by shedding the business. From outside, for a while, both look identical, which is the lesson underneath all of this, and it applies well beyond aerospace. Every organization eventually optimizes for whatever it measures. If the measurement rewards owning less, the organization will find things to stop owning, and it will keep going until something breaks that the measurement was never designed to see. Boeing didn't lose Alan Mulally. It chose someone else twice and then spent 20 years buying back the things it had been told to sell. He's 80 now. Ford recovered its blue oval logo in 2012 when its credit rating returned to investment grade, and he retired in 2014. His name came up again when Boeing needed a chief executive in 2019, and again in 2024 when it needed one after that. Both times, someone else got the job, but when the current chief executive took over Boeing and started trying to fix it, one of the people he reportedly went to for advice was Alan Mulally, which tells you something. The company keeps calling the man it wouldn't promote. And there's one more thread here. That Wichita factory Boeing has now bought back builds fuselages for an airplane whose basic design dates to 1964, an aircraft Boeing cannot stop making, cannot fundamentally fix, and cannot afford to replace. That's the next one.